In this section of the lecture, I'm going to give a perspective on what was happening in other parts of Europe, or on the spread of the Industrial Revolution to the rest of Europe. To start off with, I've got a couple of graphs that show the evolution of GDP per capita in several other countries as well as the UK. The first slide shows a group of countries that are often referred to as the early industrialisers, France, Belgium and Germany. And they're referred to as early industrialisers in the sense that they started to experience increases in GDP per capita, not as early as the UK, but at a relatively early stage amongst other countries in Europe after the Industrial Revolution has occurred in Britain. So, we're talking about from sort of around about the mid, maybe even a little bit before that, 19th century, you can see GDP per capita taking off in those countries. There are other countries in Europe which were much slower to move, and I've shown just a sample of those countries here. So, for example, if you look at sort of Italy, you can see really not until about 1900 do we start to see GDP per capita taking off. If we look at Sweden, sort of we get relatively slow or relatively flat, a little bit of increase. Again, not really taking off until the last part of the 19th century. And the other country there is Spain, where you can see sort of again kind of slow increase, but then taking off to the extent that it does take off at all, only sort of after around 1890. As another way of expressing these data, I've just for selected time periods shown the ratio of GDP per capita to the UK. And it makes sort of a similar kind of point in that you can see, for example, France sort of from in 1850 is 73% of British GDP, and then sort of begins to increase against British GDP after that. Germany, it takes a little bit longer for the takeoff to start. It's sort of mid-50s up until 1870, then a little bit of an increase there, and then a big increase from 1890 to 1910. Whereas in the other countries, sort of, it's really sort of, if you look at Sweden, it's only after 1890 that you get the takeoff. Italy, in fact, declines against the UK and then sort of increases a bit from 1890 to 1910. So what I take from this is sort of 2 points. That generally throughout Europe there was a common pattern of increasing GDP per capita, and what had happened initially is that the UK had moved ahead of these other countries in Europe by having the Industrial Revolution first, but as well as increasing GDP per capita, these other countries actually start to catch up to some degree with the UK. But the second point is there's a lot of heterogeneity there as well. The timing at which the takeoff in GDP per capita occurs is quite different, and the rate of increase in GDP per capita once this happens differs between countries. So there's two sort of elements here, or two patterns to the history sort of. There's a part of the story is that Europe in general begins to grow at a more rapid rate and catches up to the UK, but that there's a lot of heterogeneity in that story as the second point. So what I want to do in the rest of this section of the lecture is talk a little bit about the main patterns of catch-up. The first thing I want to talk about is getting the technology sort of. And here there's, roughly speaking, perhaps very roughly speaking, sort of two phases you can think of. It does seem that in the first phase of other countries in Europe industrialising and developing in that way, that the industrialisation initially involved taking technology from Britain. So this quote from Pollard, who's written one of the main works on the period, says, "The technical and organisational changes, the factories, ironworks, coal mines and machines installed in them, these were, at least until the middle of the 19th century, simply taken over from Britain." The way in which that happened is a very interesting story in itself, and this quote from Kindleberger suggests some of the ways. The various methods of technology transfer from Britain to the continent, espionage, and there's some great stories about some of the espionage activity involved in taking this new ideas for how to produce from Britain back to the continent, but people travelling, machinery imports, whether open or smuggled, the hiring of workers from Britain who then could bring their technical knowledge to the continent, the attraction of entrepreneurs, that is bringing entrepreneurs again who had the knowledge of how to do the new way of production from Britain to the continent. They are some of the reasons why this occurred, but they're not, they don't exhaust the reasons. And Kindleberger goes on in the quote to talk about what he thinks is important natural diffusion. That is just the press, foreign and domestic journals, scientific and trade journals. So information transmission sort of through, one of the phenomena that we talked about when we talked about the scientific revolution and the industrial enlightenment, sort of the idea that there was better transmission of knowledge about the new technical developments and inventions, and that actually facilitated the transfer of those inventions elsewhere. The second sort of phase that you can think of is when other countries are also joining in the technological development. So it's no longer simply taking ideas from Britain. It never entirely was anyway, but to a greater extent in the period sort of after 1850, some other countries in Europe begin to join in that process of technological development, and that becomes a more important part of their industrialisation. So examples would be the major role that French and German inventors have in the development of the steel industry, or at the end of the 19th century, the important German role in the development of new chemical products and electrical equipment. The next theme I want to talk about in this period of the spread of industrialisation, having talked about how the technology got from Britain to the rest of Europe, is what determined the use of that technology. And here we'll see some sort of common or some themes that will be familiar to us from having thought about the Industrial Revolution in Britain. One point is that it seems that where industrialisation occurred most, or occurred most successfully, increasing agricultural productivity was important. So for example, in Germany, which was one of the successful and early industrialisers, there were big increases in agricultural productivity in the 19th century due to increasing land usage from taking up extra land, from more efficiently cropping the land, and also the same type of improvements that were made in Britain in improving soil quality. Size of market was also important. So developments in transport, the surfaced roads, increasing railways were important for creating national markets that could be the basis of supplying a market for the new industrial products that were being produced. National integration was important. So for example, in Germany, the creation of the German Empire in the 1870s, the creation of a customs union within Prussia in the 1830s, again had the effect of reducing the cost of trading within a larger sized market. Population growth, which happened to different degrees in different countries in Europe, but where it did happen, sort of most, that was important in expanding market size. Protection against international trade, whether where it was adopted it was a good thing or a bad thing is still sort of debated. But yeah, important point is in general that having a large size market was important for promoting industrialisation in Europe during this period. This is some data that sort of give a perspective on one of the ways in which those larger size of markets were created, the amount of kilometres of railways during the 19th century. And so you can see in 1840 it's really only Britain that has at all sort of a developed railway network. But that as you get to 1870 and then even more as you get to 1914, you've got France, Germany, also Britain sort of developing major railway networks linking together the country into a single market. Not only linking together into a single market for selling manufactured goods, but reducing the transport costs, for example, of bringing coal from the place where it's mined to the place where it's going to be used in the manufacture of industrial goods. So Role of increasing agricultural productivity, size of market were important. What else was important? Well, access to resources were important. So again, you were using industrial technologies that were taken from Britain that depended on having sort of some source of power. So you needed access to water power, or you needed access to coal supplies, which could be used to power steam engines, which would be the basis of the manufacturing industry. So countries that had most access to resources, for example, Germany, Belgium, and France, which was able to maintain a reliance on water power, were able to industrialise sort of early. Institutions and institutional change also seems to have been important. That mattered at the micro level. For example, removing restrictions on peasantry in Germany is likely to have been one factor that stimulated agricultural productivity. Some economic historians have thought about this on a much larger scale. Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson have argued that the French Revolution basically caused a thoroughgoing change in institutions in the regions in Europe where that revolution's reached, and that had long-term effects on the capacity to industrialise. So they say the leaders of the French Revolution and subsequently Napoleon exported the revolution, and that revolution got rid of feudal relations, it got rid of guilds, it got rid of the absolutist power of monarchs, it got rid of the power of the clergy. And what that did was to allow the creation of economic institutions that provided the basis for industrialisation. And so they have analysis in the study that they did of the French Revolution, which argues that you can observe a much more rapid rate of industrialisation in areas that the French controlled, where they made these changes in institutions, than in other areas where that didn't happen. So we can see that there's some familiar themes about industrialisation in the rest of Europe compared to Britain. That agricultural productivity was important, that having a large market was important, that having the right type of institutions was important, and having access to resources which were needed as inputs to the industrialisation process was also important. One way in which you can then sort of elaborate on that is by thinking about the extent to which differences in those factors can explain cross-country differences in growth experience. So one difference that's often pointed to is the difference between Germany and France, where it's argued that, look, Germany was a bit later to start industrialising, but when it started, it grew more rapidly than France. Whereas France began industrialising, began increasing GDP per capita earlier, but its growth rate was slower. And one way to understand that then is to say, well, look, the problem in Germany was that they had impediments to industrialising because there were restrictions on at least some of those four factors. So in Germany there was a high degree of political and hence market fragmentation. So until the Prussian Customs Union, until you get the German Empire being created, you don't really get Germany being unified into a single sort of economic unit. Germany had extensive resources of coal and iron ore, but those tended to be located on its borders. And so it was only once Germany developed a sufficiently extensive rail network that those resources could be incorporated into industrialisation. But once those impediments are removed, then Germany actually, it does have relatively large supplies of those resources. It does have a relatively large national market to which it can sell. And it is successfully expanding agricultural productivity. So Germany takes a while to remove the impediments to growth, but when those impediments are removed, it's actually able to grow strongly because it sort of has favourable endowments of those characteristics of agricultural productivity, resources and so on. Whereas France is initially in a better position to follow Britain because it doesn't have the same impediments, for example, on perhaps market unification, but it does have some limitations. For example, it lacks the large amounts of sort of coal and iron ore resources that Germany does. Perhaps for institutional reasons, it's much slower to develop an extensive rail network. And it's less successful in switching its population from agriculture to industry and in improving agricultural productivity. And so that causes slower population growth, which also sort of acts against increase in market size. So you wouldn't want to think that the explanatory framework could explain every difference between countries, but there's an extent to which we can take those familiar factors and apply them to also understand why there were differences between countries. It's also worth mentioning just a couple of other sort of influences which aren't so familiar to us from talking about Britain, but which also seem to have been important during this episode. So whereas during the Industrial Revolution, it seems, in Britain, it seems that a lot of the financing of the new industries was done internally. In Europe, in the continental Europe, it seems that banks played a much larger role. So for example, you had the Credit Mobilier in France in the 1850s, which a large purpose of which was to finance railways. You had German banks such as Deutsche and Dresdner being established in the 1870s, which developed long-run relationships with industrial clients and financed their activities. You also have, at least in some regards, a quite important role for the state in European industrialisation. One example of which is after the industrialisations of Britain has occurred, a lot of the knowledge of that industrialisation, particularly the technical knowledge, begins to get codified and written down in various ways. And so that means, whereas education doesn't seem to have been a particularly important driver of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, it does become, because the knowledge is now codified, a more important driver of industrialisation in continental Europe. And for example, there's been some nice empirical analysis done of the relationship between education and industrialisation in Prussia, showing that regions where literacy standards were higher were regions where there was a greater amount of industrialisation able to occur. A final important point to talk about is just recognising comparative advantage. Cameron and Neil have made the point that, and this is probably in particular with reference to countries that industrialised later, a key factor that determined whether countries that industrialised later were able to be successful or not was their ability to adapt to the international division of labour determined by the early industrialisers, work out what they were good at and specialise in producing those types of goods and services. And so that basically means, look, Germany and France and Belgium and England, they've staked out to be the producers of steel and iron, the heavy sort of industrial equipment, chemicals sort of as well, electrical goods. So these other countries had to fit into that schema somehow. And so, for example, you have Denmark becoming in this phase a specialised supplier of agricultural output to those other regions in Europe. Or you have Norway becoming a specialist provider of timber and shipping services, or Sweden becoming one area it specialises in is provision of timber. So they're providing sort of some of the inputs, some of the sort of basic inputs which are needed for the other countries which are sort of at a higher stage of industrialisation. And of course, once they begin to produce these goods, it can then become the basis for upstream industrialisation. So Sweden, for example, begins just exporting logs as the type of timber to other countries. But then it gets into producing milled timber. So the actual sort of finished timber produced in sawmills becomes the product that it exports. And that provides a basis for then other stages of industrialisation.